Welcome to Karen Universe, where we dive into every wild, quirky, and intriguing story out there. Every morning, that same car was ruining my lawn, and it had gone to fire. In the end, I took decisive action with my own hands. What did I do next? Stay with me and watch the end of the video.
The moment I saw his black SUV roll onto my grass again, I knew this wasn't just a parking problem, it was war. Not the kind with shouting or fists, but the quiet suburban kind, where revenge simmers behind polite smiles and trimmed hedges. Our HOA president had made my lawn his personal driveway, and today was the day everything changed. If you think a single can of expanding foam can't rewrite a neighborhood legend, stay with me, because the story only gets stranger from here. It started innocently. A community barbecue, folding chairs, plastic cups, and one oversized SUV creeping onto my freshly cut lawn like it owned the place. I waved. He waved back. The tire stayed exactly where it was. I figured it was a mistake, the kind people fix when they notice muddy tracks in green grass. But the next morning, the same black tire print carved into my yard like a signature. He parked there again, as if my lawn had a reserved sign with his name on it. I tried being reasonable. I knocked on his door with a smile and a calm voice, explaining how the grass had just been reseeded and needed time to heal. He nodded slowly, thanked me for bringing it up, and assured me it wouldn't happen again. The next afternoon, his SUV returned, right on cue, crushing hope and clover together. That was when the HOA fines started arriving, not for him, but for me. Apparently, my lawn looked uneven and damaged. I stared at the notice, realizing the man who ruined my yard was also charging me for it. Weeks passed. Every new tire mark felt personal. Neighbors whispered about it like it was a feud in an old Western movie, except with sprinklers instead of saloons. I emailed, I called, I even printed out HOA rules about respecting property lines. Each attempt vanished into silence. His SUV, however, stayed loyal to my grass. One night, while cleaning out the garage, I found a half-forgotten can of expanding foam from an old repair job. I picked it up, reading the warning label about how it hardens into an unmovable shape. My mind did something dangerous. It connected dots it shouldn't have connected. A slow, wicked plan formed, simple enough to sound ridiculous, bold enough to sound brilliant. I didn't want to destroy anything. I wanted a lesson, one that wouldn't need words. Something that would say, "This lawn is not your parking lot," louder than any complaint letter ever could. By the time the sun rose, the can sat by my door like a loaded secret, waiting for its moment. The next morning arrived with the kind of calm that feels suspicious, like the world is holding its breath. I watched through the window as the HOA president's black SUV rolled in slow motion toward my lawn, its tires cutting across the grass like a ruler drawing a straight, disrespectful line. He parked, locked the doors, and walked away without a glance, as if my yard was part of the street. That was the moment my plan stopped being an idea and became an action. I waited until evening, when porch lights flickered on and the neighborhood settled into its usual routine of dogs barking and televisions glowing through windows. I slipped into the garage and grabbed the can of expanding foam, cold and heavy in my hand. The instructions warned about gloves, goggles, and ventilation. I followed them like I was preparing for surgery instead of revenge. My heart thumped louder than it should have, not from fear of being caught, but from the thrill of doing something that felt final. I stepped onto the lawn and crouched near the front tire of his SUV. The grass was flattened where the rubber pressed down, still damp from the sprinkler system. I shook the can gently, hearing the liquid slosh inside. The nozzle pointed into the narrow space between tire and ground. For a second, I hesitated. This was the line between being patient and being unforgettable. I pressed the trigger. A thick, pale foam oozed out, creeping under the tire like a slow, hungry creature. It filled every gap, expanding outward and upward, hugging the rubber as if it had been waiting for this job its entire life. I moved carefully, tracing the curve of the tire, making sure the foam wrapped around it without touching the paint. The hiss of the spray sounded louder in the quiet night, but no lights came on. No doors opened. When I finished, the foam looked innocent enough, like spilled insulation, but I knew what it would become. In minutes, it would harden into something stubborn and solid. I stepped back, wiped my hands, and returned inside, leaving the SUV resting on a trap of its own making. Sleep did not come easily. My mind replayed every second, imagining him in the morning, coffee in hand, ready to drive off like nothing happened. I pictured the tire refusing to move, the engine revving in confusion. I wasn't proud, exactly, but I felt lighter, as if the grass itself had asked me to stand up for it. At sunrise, I took my coffee to the window and waited. The black SUV sat exactly where it had been left, but now its front tire looked glued to the earth. The stage was set. All that was missing was the actor. He came out just after 8, phone in one hand, travel mug in the other, already annoyed at something invisible. He pressed the key fob, heard the familiar chirp, and slid into the driver's seat with the confidence of a man who believed the world moved when he told it to. The engine started. The SUV did not. At first he assumed the brake was on. Then he tried again, easing forward, then backward. The tire stayed married to my lawn. He stepped out, stared down, and frowned like the grass had betrayed him personally. I watched from behind the curtain, holding my breath. He crouched and touched the pale mass hugging the tire. It looked soft, but when he poked it, his finger bounced back. Confusion turned into irritation. He pulled harder, as if force alone could undo chemistry. The foam didn't budge. Instead, it revealed its true nature, locked around the tread like a custom-made mold. Soon, the spectacle drew an audience. Mrs. Alvarez from across the street slowed her jog. The mail carrier pretended to sort letters nearby. Even the teenager with the loud bike paused to stare. The HOA president straightened his jacket and tried to laugh it off, waving like this was all part of a joke he understood. He reached into the trunk and produced a small crowbar. He wedged it between tire and foam, levering with careful, frustrated movements. Chunks broke away, but the core stayed firm, stubborn as a grudge. Each scrape sounded like plastic teeth grinding together. His phone rang. He answered it with a voice too cheerful for the scene unfolding at his feet. I felt a strange mix of victory and nerves. This was the lesson I wanted, but lessons have a way of growing legs and walking into consequences. What if he blamed vandals? What if he blamed me? The can in my garage felt like evidence now, not a tool. After 20 minutes of struggle, he slumped against the hood, defeated by something that came out of a can for $6 and change. He called for a tow truck, explaining the situation in clipped sentences. I imagined the dispatcher trying not to laugh. The tow truck arrived with hydraulic patience, lifting the SUV just enough to free the trapped wheel. The foam came with it, still clinging like a badge of shame. As the vehicle rolled away, it left behind a crater in my lawn and a story the street would repeat for weeks. I took a step outside at last. The grass was damaged, but quiet. For the first time in months, there were no tire tracks crossing it. The silence felt earned. Morning sunlight painted the scene with a calm, undeniable warning forever afterward. By noon, the story had traveled faster than the tow truck. Neighbors texted screenshots of the foam-locked tire, adding laughing emojis and wild theories about raccoons with construction skills. The HOA president sent out a group email blaming unknown vandals and promising an investigation. He didn't mention my lawn. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. That afternoon, an official notice appeared on my door. It cited property damage and improper parking near a landscaped area, a thin attempt to turn the mess into my responsibility. I read it twice, then a third time, listening to the wind brush the grass like it was whispering advice. I drafted a reply that was calm, polite, and loaded with dates, photos, and the exact clause about respecting private property lines. We met at the clubhouse the next evening. Fluorescent lights hummed over folding tables and a pot of burnt coffee. He sat at the head like a judge, but his confidence had a crack in it. I slid my phone across the table and scrolled through weeks of images, his SUV on my lawn, the fresh tracks, the warning letters. Each swipe made the room quieter. He tried to argue it was temporary, that he only parked there when the street was full. I asked why the street was never too full for anyone else. He said he'd spoken to me. I reminded him he'd promised it would stop. The board members exchanged looks, the kind that say a story is collapsing. Then someone asked about the foam. He cleared his throat and blamed teenagers. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The rule book did the talking. The clause was simple: repeated violations result in fines and loss of privileges. The president's privileges were on the table. By the end of the meeting, a decision landed like a stamp. He would pay for the lawn repair. The warnings against me were withdrawn. And the parking policy would be enforced, including for officers. The room exhaled. Outside, the night smelled like cut grass and hot asphalt. He avoided my eyes, muttering about misunderstandings. I wished him a good evening and meant it. Revenge had done its job, but justice had finished the paperwork. Back home, I set a small wooden border along the edge of the lawn. It wasn't a wall. It was a reminder. The grass would grow back. The message, I hoped, would stay. Later, I placed the empty foam can in the trash and watered the damaged patch until the soil darkened. The yard looked wounded but proud, like a field after a hard rain. Some battles are loud. Some are quiet. This one left a mark without leaving a scar. Neighbors noticed and nodded as if they understood finally. The days after the meeting felt oddly peaceful, like the street had exhaled after holding its breath too long. My lawn, though scarred, became a symbol of something unspoken, a quiet boundary finally respected. Neighbors waved differently now, with knowing smiles that carried more meaning than words. Even the mail carrier slowed down to glance at the repaired patch, as if checking on a patient's recovery. The HOA president kept his distance. His SUV never crossed the invisible line again, not even by an inch. Instead, he parked farther down the street, choosing long walks over short victories. I wondered if every step reminded him of that stubborn foam, frozen in place like a monument to poor judgment. Power, I learned, doesn't like to be embarrassed, especially in front of an audience. One afternoon, Mrs. Alvarez brought over a small potted plant. She said it would help the grass grow stronger, but I knew it was really a thank you wrapped in soil and leaves. We talked about how rules were meant to protect people, not punish them. She admitted she had received warnings before, too, for things that weren't her fault. The foam incident had given everyone courage they didn't know they needed. Word spread beyond our block. At the grocery store, a man in line behind me whispered, "You're the lawn guy, right?" I nodded, unsure whether to feel proud or concerned. He laughed and said he wished he had thought of something that clever when his neighbor blocked his driveway. Stories have a way of growing bigger once they leave the place they were born. At home, I studied the repaired grass every morning. Tiny green blades pushed through the dark soil, stubborn and hopeful. It felt like watching a lesson take root. The lawn no longer looked like a problem. It looked like proof that even small spaces deserve respect. Then came the newsletter. The HOA released a revised parking policy, bolded and underlined, reminding everyone that private property lines were not optional suggestions. No names were mentioned, but the message was clear. The foam had not only stopped a car, it had shifted a rule book. I never told anyone what I did. Silence was part of the solution. Let the mystery grow. Let the lesson spread without fingerprints. Sometimes the best justice wears no signature. By the end of the week, life returned to its ordinary rhythms, sprinklers clicking on at dusk, dogs barking at shadows, engines starting and stopping where they belonged. My lawn rested, free from tires, free from warnings, free from quiet resentment. I realized something important in those calm moments. Standing up doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means choosing a strange, creative path when all the normal ones fail. And sometimes, one can of expanding foam can redraw the lines of a whole neighborhood. Peace has a strange way of making you think the story is over, even when it's only paused. 2 weeks passed without incident, and I started to believe the lesson had settled in permanently. My lawn grew thicker, greener, as if it enjoyed its new status as protected ground. Then, on a quiet Saturday morning, a white envelope appeared in my mailbox with the HOA logo stamped in blue. Inside was a formal notice requesting my presence at a special review meeting. The wording was polite, but the tone felt sharp, like a smile hiding teeth. Someone had filed a complaint about suspicious activity near a parked vehicle. No names were listed, but I knew exactly whose pride was still bruised. At the meeting, the room felt colder than usual. The board sat in their usual line, papers stacked neatly in front of them. The HOA president wasn't at the head this time. He took a seat among the others, stiff and quiet. A board member cleared her throat and explained that an investigation had been requested regarding the foam incident. The word vandalism hung in the air like smoke. I listened carefully, letting them finish. Then I spoke, slowly and clearly, reminding them that the earlier ruling had already assigned responsibility for the damage and resolved the matter. I pointed out that no evidence had ever proven who applied the foam, only that the vehicle had been repeatedly parked on private property. I brought printed photos again, dates and times highlighted like a timeline of stubbornness. The discussion drifted in circles. Some board members wanted to reopen the issue. Others worried about setting a precedent. The HOA president finally spoke, saying it was time to move on and focus on community harmony. His voice was flat, tired. It sounded less like forgiveness and more like surrender. When the vote came, the decision was simple. The matter would not be reopened. The earlier ruling stood. The complaint was dismissed. A quiet shuffle of papers ended the drama, not with fireworks, but with a stamp and a sigh. Outside, the sun felt warmer than before. I walked home with a strange mix of relief and reflection. Revenge had started this, but boundaries had finished it. The foam had been a spark. The rules had been the fire break. That evening, I watered the lawn again, watching the droplets cling to the blades of grass. The yard no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a reminder of something bigger. When people in charge forget the line between authority and entitlement, even the smallest resistance can reset the balance. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The kind of steady that comes after a storm, when you know the clouds can return, but the ground remembers how to drain the rain. My lawn, once a shortcut for a careless SUV, had become a symbol of a quiet win. And in that silence, I wondered if the story would truly end here, or if pride would find one more way to test the boundary. Pride did test the boundary, but not with tires. It came disguised as kindness. One evening, the HOA president knocked on my door holding a clipboard and a smile that looked practiced in a mirror. He said he wanted to clear the air, to show good faith, to propose a compromise that would benefit the street. I invited him in, offered water, and listened. He explained a new plan to paint subtle curb markers near my lawn, claiming it would guide parking without singling anyone out. The idea sounded reasonable until he added that the markers would be placed slightly inside my property line, just for alignment. I saw the trick immediately. A painted inch today becomes a parked foot tomorrow. I thanked him and asked for the proposal in writing. He hesitated, then said the board could approve it quickly if I agreed on the spot. I declined. Boundaries work best when they are boring and exact. He left with the same smile, thinner now. The next morning, orange flags appeared near the edge of my grass. Not paint, but survey markers, fluttering like tiny warnings. Neighbors gathered, curious. I pulled out the HOA map and measured the line with the tape. The flags leaned into my yard by 3 inches. 3 inches of old habits trying to sneak back. I sent a group email with photos, measurements, and the rule that property lines could not be altered without consent. I kept the tone neutral. Facts do more damage than insults. Within an hour, the flags were gone. That afternoon, the HOA president sent a short apology, saying the markers were a misunderstanding by a contractor. The word misunderstanding has a way of shrinking mistakes until they look like shadows. I replied with a simple thanks and asked that future changes be shared with the community first. No blame. No drama. Just light. The neighborhood noticed. People began asking questions at meetings. Where exactly were the lines? Who decided changes? The answers became slower, more careful. Power adjusts when it is watched. At sunset, I sat on the porch and watched cars parked neatly along the curb. The space beside my lawn stayed empty, like a seat no one dared take. The grass moved in the breeze, and I thought about how small victories can teach big lessons. Not every conflict needs a grand ending. Sometimes it needs repetition, the quiet kind that trains behavior. I realized the foam was only the first chapter in a longer story about attention. Once the spotlight turned on, it stayed on. And under that light, shortcuts looked exactly like what they were. The lesson lingered, shaping choices in small, lasting ways. With the flags gone and the curb left untouched, the street slipped into a new routine, one shaped by caution instead of convenience. People parked a little farther from lawns, opened doors more carefully, and glanced at property lines as if they were suddenly visible. It was strange how one small incident could recalibrate a whole block's habits. The memory of the foam had become a quiet warning sign, invisible but understood. The HOA president avoided me now, not out of fear, but out of something closer to embarrassment. When we crossed paths at meetings, his voice was softer, his words chosen like fragile glass. He talked more about community and less about authority. I wondered if losing a single battle had taught him what winning too many can cost. One evening, a new family moved in 2 houses down. They brought boxes, a rented truck, and the nervous excitement of starting over. I watched them park carefully along the curb, leaving a respectful gap between the tires and the grass. They didn't know the story, but they followed the rule as if it had always existed. That was when I understood the difference between revenge and change. Revenge ends with a reaction. Change continues without needing another spark. The lawn grew thick again, hiding the last faint mark where the foam had once clung. The soil held the memory longer than people did, but even it eventually let go. Each time I mowed, I thought about how close I had come to turning a small conflict into a loud one. The quiet path had worked better. At the next HOA meeting, parking was no longer the main topic. Instead, people discussed lighting, trash schedules, and holiday decorations. Ordinary problems replaced the dramatic ones. I felt oddly proud of that. Normalcy had returned, not because everyone agreed, but because boundaries had been accepted. After the meeting, Mrs. Alvarez whispered that the board was considering rotating leadership positions more often. Fresh voices, she said, might keep power from getting too comfortable. I smiled, thinking about how a can of foam had nudged the idea forward without ever being mentioned. At home, I placed a small stone marker at the edge of the lawn, subtle and clean. It didn't shout "stay off," but it said this belongs to someone. Ownership doesn't need to be aggressive. It only needs to be clear. As night settled, I sat on the porch and listened to the quiet hum of engines in the distance. No tires crossed the grass. No notes appeared on my door. The conflict had faded into something close to legend, a story neighbors told new arrivals with a half smile and a raised eyebrow. Somewhere between the foam and the flags, the neighborhood had learned a shared language. It spoke in inches, lines, and mutual respect. And for the first time in months, my lawn felt like just a lawn again, not a stage for stubbornness, but a patch of ground allowed to be ordinary. Years later, the story still surfaced whenever someone complained about parking or power. It had become a kind of neighborhood myth, passed along with a laugh and a warning. New residents heard it during casual conversations, usually framed as a joke, but always ending with the same moral: lines exist for a reason. I never corrected the details when they grew exaggerated. Let the legend do the work. The HOA president eventually stepped down. His goodbye speech was filled with words like service and cooperation, and for the first time, they sounded sincere. Leadership rotated after that, and meetings felt less like courtrooms and more like conversations. People disagreed, but they listened. The lawn stayed untouched, not because anyone feared consequences, but because the habit had changed. One afternoon, I found an old photo on my phone, taken on the day the tow truck came. The tire lifted, the foam clinging stubbornly, the grass bent beneath it all. It looked dramatic now, almost staged. I realized how easily that moment could have turned ugly, how a small act of defiance could have spiraled into something loud and bitter. Instead, it had quietly rerouted behavior. The lawn itself became my favorite proof. Each spring, it came back thicker than before, as if it enjoyed its own comeback story. I planted a small tree near the edge, not as a barrier, but as a marker of time. It grew slowly, year by year, casting a thin line of shade where tires once crossed. The tree didn't argue. It simply existed, claiming its space without force. Sometimes I thought about the kin of expanding foam and how strange it was that such an ordinary object had carried so much meaning. It wasn't the foam that mattered. It was the moment someone finally said no in a way that couldn't be ignored. The trick wasn't the action. It was the boundary behind it. Neighbors still teased me about it. They called it the Great Parking War and raised imaginary cans in salute. I laughed with them, but I never boasted. Quiet victories don't need trophies. They just need time to settle into routine. Looking back, I understood something simple. Power listens when rules speak louder than pride. Respect grows when it's enforced evenly. And sometimes, a neighborhood doesn't need a hero. It just needs someone willing to draw a line and stand behind it. My lawn remains ordinary now. Kids cut across it when chasing balls. Leaves pile up in autumn. Snow settles in winter. But cars stay off it. That small change reminds me how fragile order can be, and how easily it can be repaired when someone refuses to look away. The story ends the way it began, with grass under open sky, free from tires, free from arguments. Just a patch of ground doing its quiet job, holding the memory of a lesson learned and a line that stayed where it belonged.
If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.